It was 1950, end of 50, beginning of 51 when I went on to had my first experience on the Canberra. Probably, I could give you the exact date, but I would think it was 51. And as I said, I went to Binbrook, to 617 Squadron, commanded by a very interesting friend of mine called Pat Connolly. And I managed to get a trip into Canberra, which was about an hour, watching the things happening, sitting on the rumble seat, and then about half an hour actually flying the airplane with my own navigator in the back. He stuck his neck out and came. But that was, in those days there weren't any dual T4s or anything like that, so that's the way we did it. Well, thereafter, you'd like me to go on to back at the Benson, our station on 540 Squadron. We got our first Canberra, and we went through the processes that I described, and we gradually got the whole squadron off on the airplane. But that was later, because in the meantime I was sent by Bomber Command to Boscombe Down, and I flew the prototype there, which generally speaking was the same as the production PR3, not the B2. It was a PR3. It was slightly longer, and it had not very different characteristics, but some different characteristics to the B2. It carried more fuel, so it was capable of very much longer flights, and pressure breathing equipment in case of trouble. And we flew around we went to Tripoli in North Africa for the tropical trials and for the evaluation of the camera and photography. And we started off by simple flights, evaluating the camera and checking on vibration and the truth and definition and resolution of the images on the photographic side. And thereafter we tried it out on long-range flying, navigation and control of fuel and the other things. And it was, in fact, I think we did 8 hours, which was, at that time, the longest that a jet, or RAF jet anyway, had been airborne continuously, I think, because the other big jets hadn't come into service at all. They were just coming in. The Valiant was the first one, to be followed by the Vulcan and the Victor. But we did the first long-range trips of up to 8.5 to 9 hours around in the Mediterranean. And then when that was finished, we went back, took the airplane back to Boscombe Down, and it was at that time that the first Canberras began to come into service with 540 Squadron. And I did finally. I converted the squadron, and we had about 12 crews at that time, and we finished at the end of 53 with a complete squadron of Canberras, PR, the first PR squadron. And then, at the beginning of 53, the New Zealand Air Race had been mooted, and they chose the crews who were going to take part. We had a very interesting character who was our wing commander flying at Benson and afterwards at Whitton, called Idwell, Wing Commander Idwell Edwards, Huey Edwards, VC. He was a very interesting chap. I don't want to in any way denigrate him, but I think it's generally accepted he wasn't a terribly astute pilot. He was very keen that I should send him solo on the Canberra, but after a few flights with him, I didn't do so, and he didn't hold it against me. He realized that there was, he needed more practice. Anyway, that just about covers the skeleton of what we did. But in the air race flight in '53, we had to reconsider the flying and the navigating of the Canberra to get long-range, accurate flying, very accurate navigation, the weather flying, because we were going to have probably monsoons on halfway in India, and we also had to control, because we wanted to fly at the fastest true airspeed between points, we had to use all the fuel that we had to the best advantage, and that meant calculating on a basis of how goes it, in other words, how much fuel you've used and how much you calculate you have to go, and then adjust your speed, or more particularly your height, because the lower down, the warmer, the better would be your true airspeed, which is what we were after. So that is the way we went about it. And tremendous amount of good, solid information was forthcoming from our working up. And we flew from Witten to, first of all, we used to go out to Tripoli and back. And one of the things that was bothering everybody was whether or not it was worth, in the PR3, which had 2 tons of paraffin aboard, whether or not it was worth having another 200 gallons in 2 100-gallon drop tanks, or whether the effects of having the drop tanks and the retardation and the fact that you had to fly, you were restricted in your speeds, whether it was worth accepting that. So one morning I went off from Witten with drop tanks on, full, and we did a trip to Tripoli, turned overhead to see whether or not it was an advantage. So when we got over Tripoli, we called up overhead and went back to Witten, landed. They took off the drop tanks. We refueled with the full 2.4 and went back to Tripoli, and we'd been over there at about 10 o'clock in the morning. We were back over there at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the controller on duty, to whom we'd spoken earlier, called me up and said, "What are you in up there, a balloon?" So I explained that we were doing a round trip, but that was one of the flights we did. We then went out as far as, a couple of times, as far as Colombo, in, where is it, in Madras, in Ceylon. And then the final flight, before the air race was due to take place, we were going to fly all the way out to the Cocos Islands, turn overhead Cocos and back to Ceylon and then back home. Well, we started off on that flight, and we did from Witten to Shaiba, Iraq, and refueled, and then took off from Shaiba to go to Colombo, and we had taken off in the afternoon, roughly at the time the air race was due to start, which was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So when we got to Colombo, when we got to Shaiba, it was pitch black, refueled, and took off to go to Colombo. And in the course of the flight to Colombo, the aircraft oversped. In other words, we were flying at about 0.82 Mach, and to maintain an even keel, it was nosing down a little and going up to 8.3, 8.4, and then back. And then suddenly, because having the extra fuel in the bomb bay, made it very unstable in the initial part of the flight, and for that reason it was porpoising a little. And then suddenly the nose dug in. It had gone up to about 8.4, and I was trimming back on the autopilot, and then it went straight in, and we got the throttles off, and we were going down in a shock stall, and it was very, very rough. I could hear the navigator at the back complaining vigorously as he was being thrashed around the cockpit and wondering what the hell was happening, and the controls were absolutely solid. You couldn't move them, they were just solid. And then gradually as we came down, because we were going down vertically, the air getting thicker, we slowed up and control started to come. And then instead of hauling to try and pull the nose up, I was pushing like hell to stop it breaking its back. It felt as if it might want to. So finally we got it out, and all the instruments had toppled. It was a pitch black night, there was no moon, and the maps that were stuck to the perspex with coffee, which had frozen immediately, and there were stalactites of coffee coming down, and the whole thing was a shambles. But after a small discussion, we decided we'd press on to go to Colombo, and we landed at Ratmalana, which in those days was the Air Force base. And on inspection, the aircraft, we got there in the morning in daylight, and when we got out and had a look, the whole of the paint on the tail leading from the rear transit section the tail had been doing that, and the paint had come off in stress lines. It was most interesting. Anyway, it didn't come apart, which it would have done with about a 0.01 more on it. I think we did, according to Page, about Mach 0.94, and that was about the point he reckons that the airplane would have given up. But you'll see it in the museum now, and it's holding together. And it went on and flew quite a lot in the Air Force afterwards. It was on 540 Squadron, I think, and it went out on 13 Squadron at one stage. Somebody told me they were flying it. There. Was there...
In the floods, Monty, what?
Oh, well, that was on mosquitoes, yes. Oh, yes, that was on mosquitoes.
That's really very interesting, actually. I know a number of people will be most interested in that last piece of technical information you've given me. Can we come to the New Zealand trip, actually?
Yes, sure.
Because this is really, I believe the record still stands.
It does, yes. It's amazing that it still stands.
Can you tell me the lead up and talk through exactly what's happened?
Yes, sure.
Why was there a need to do this
air race? Well, the first thing was that the New Zealanders are fantastically proud of being British, as you probably know. And they've always felt that they were a hell of a long way away from England, and they had made their first international airport at Harwood in Christchurch on the southern plain. And a gentleman who I got to know very well was instrumental. His name was Hume Christie, and he decided that in order to bring Christchurch International Airport in front of the rest of the world, to try and drum up some flights in and out, other than the ones they had at that time, they should have an air race rather like the one they'd had to Melbourne in 1938, right, or 37, something like that, won by Scott and Black in a Comet. Anyway, they were running this international air race on similar lines, and they had three sections. There was a general speed section in which all sorts of people entered all sorts of airplanes, including an old Hudson, Lockheed Hudson, 2 or 3 Australian Mosquitoes were going to enter. The Americans were trying to enter aircraft which were still in service, and they came up against the law which exists in the States, which said that no actual service type aircraft can be used for that sort of a demonstration, because it would give the game away as to its performance. So they were pulled out. And then there was a RAF and the Royal Australian Air Force were each going to put aircraft in. The RAF was going to have 3 PR3s and a Victor. Well, in the event the Victor didn't come up, and we finished up with 2 PR3s and the first PR7 to come off the line. The PR7 was roughly, in every way, similar to the PR3. It had slightly uprated engines, and it had about 1,000. It had 2 wing tanks with 500 guns in each. I think that was the extra. So the wing commander in charge of the air race flight, Wing Commander Hodges, he flew the PR7. And as I said earlier, we had some working up of all the airplanes we were flying. And then on the 8th of October 1953, we all assembled at London Airport, where they had also the transport section. And in the transport section, unfortunately, everybody had dropped out except British European Airways with a Viscount, and KLM, who had won the previous race to Melbourne in the transport section, and they had a DC-6, I think it was, and it was full of passengers, brides going to marry Dutchmen who had already settled in New Zealand. And the Royal New Zealand Air Force had a Hastings entered. And then, as I said, everybody had dropped out except for 5 Canberras, 3 RAF, 2 Australian, which were Australian-built B2s, and we, as I say, had the 7. Anyway, we all assembled at London Airport on the 8th of October, fairly early, about 11 o'clock in the morning. We were all there rushing around. In the afternoon, we were brought out to the aircraft, and various notable people like the Duke of Gloucester came and asked bloody silly questions, and Lord Brabazon showed up. The husband of Amy Johnson came to see me. What was his name? Jim Mollison, right. And he gave me some advice which didn't really apply to jet aircraft. And then about 4:45, I think it must have been, we were all numbered and we were going to take off with 5-minute intervals. And the first 2 aircraft, Hodges and McFurs, took off, and then it was my turn on the runway, and a man with the flag, starting flag, was there. And from my point of view anyway, I can only then talk about the race from my own standpoint. He dropped the flag and we started. At the same instant that I started down the runway, a hare got up and he went in front of me, but I overtook him. And the other thing that I think Jean told me was interesting was they saw it on television, and the chap, usual light-hearted banter, and he said, well, the airplane is taking off. And as soon as I got airborne, I lifted my wheels and I was flying west, and our course was southeast. So I put it into a fairly smart turn and went hearing round over the heads of the spectators, and this was commented on. And I was still young in those days, so he said something about being a young man in a hurry. Is that right? Anyway, we climbed away and set out for Scheibe. Our true Great Circle course would have taken us over Sofia, Bulgaria, and they wouldn't let us fly in their airspace. So, strictly speaking, we should have avoided it. But enthusiasm being what it was. I don't think we avoided it, and we had quite a reasonable conversation with them as we went overhead. And the problem was there was supposed to be a Met problem. They said that on the time of our arrival in in Basra, Shaiba, there would be fog. This was the forecast at London Airport. Well, this was a serious handicap had it occurred, because we had reckoned to arrive overhead Shaiba with 300 gallons, which was enough for a safe circuit, overshoot and circuit and landing. Well, one or two things happened. A misunderstanding on the actual event, a misunderstanding between myself and my navigator, which we resolved itself in this way. I had decided I wanted this MAC number, but he said that he had put down that we were going to fly at 0.78, and I settled down on a steady 0.82. And he was doing his how goes it graph, and about halfway along the first leg, he said to me, "We're not doing very well on fuel. What speed are you flying?" And I said, "Oh, what, the one we discussed, 8.2. He said, No. I said, 7.8. We've used up any extra we needed for messing about if we have fog for landing." So I said, "Well, there's not much we can do about it, and we'll get the latest forecast, and if necessary, we'll land at Haberneer, which is closer, to, nearer than Shaiba." So when we got within VHF range, which was reasonably far out at the heights we were flying, we called up HAB, and they said no, there was no fog there or at Shaiba, so we carried on. And then when we got into the circuit to land, we had different techniques from the normal RAF techniques. In other words, we were going to land downwind, there wasn't very much wind anyway, towards where we were going to refuel and take off into wind. And so on that basis, I positioned myself on an approach, selected undercarriage down. Nothing happened at all because we had a hydraulic pump failure. So started pumping, and the navigator came forward and pumped. I went on down, I extended the downwind leg a little, and then he turned a crosswind because we hadn't all that much fuel, and he was pumping like a maniac, and the wheels locked down. And then I selected a little flap, and he started to pump it, and by that time we were on finals, and we were doing a flatless landing, but it didn't make him. We got in, and we got to the other end of the runway faster than we would have done otherwise. So we lined up and started refueling. That wasn't too bad. There was only one thing that we didn't know at the time, and that was that the orifice for putting the fuel into the Bombay tank was about 2.5 inches, which was about 1/4 of an inch more than the nozzle of the refueler. And in the course of refueling this tank, they must have got an airlock, and they thought it was full, when in fact they'd only put about 100 of the 300 gallons into it. So we had no way of telling that, because the only way we could tell whether it was, when it was empty, was we had an ammeter in the circuit of the pump, and when it dropped right off, in other words, it wasn't using very much power, we knew that the tank was empty. So anyway, we took off from Shaiba and climbed up, and this is what happened. We found that in fact we hadn't got, we'd only had 100 gallons and the tank was empty. So then we had to reorganize our flight plan to make up 200 gallons, which meant we had to fly slightly higher and slightly slower, which we did. And on that leg, we were overtaken by the Australians for that reason. And we landed, I landed at the civil airport, Colombo, and the other aircraft went into the RAF airport. Ratmalana, was it? Can't remember. Anyway, long time ago. And we landed and refueled without any trouble. Nice, broad, hot morning in Colombo. Turned around and took off as soon as possible. I think average refueling was about 9 minutes for the 5 refueling stops. And that was, I think, the crux of the whole thing, because you see, if you do it today with a Concorde, they can't refuel in 9 minutes, and we averaged on our flying time around about 0.82 Mach, and if he does 0.2, once he's on the ground and he's used up best part of an hour refueling, it all goes by the board. Anyway, on that, the next leg, it all went swimmingly, and we were going to land at the Cocos. The PR7 had enough fuel to fly from Cocos to Perth direct. And he called me up and said he was going to do this. He was going to make a decision just coming into the Cocos as to whether he had sufficient fuel, and he was happy to go on. And he called me up and told me he was. An interesting point here was that in the Indian Ocean, because we only had VHF, we had no HF radio, they had put about 4 Washingtons from Bomber Command Squadron, and they were flying at the time we were actually going across the Indian Ocean and down to Australia, and we could call them up from practically anywhere, and they were relaying messages for us and keeping us in contact with the ground. Then, of course, it was a great help on the air-sea rescue side should anything have gone wrong. So that was one safety factor. Anyway, Bob Hodges, the PR7, decided to go on, and we went in. I saw Pete Raw, the number 2 Australian, take off. Just as I was coming in to land, he had taken off and was turning away, and I came in because I was doing the same thing, landing downwind to take off en route on the course to the south. And as I touched down, I saw a sad-looking Canberra off the runway to one side, down on one side, and it was the chief wing commander, Cumming, of the Australian Air Force, who had been very excited. They'd put up a rubber bag full of fuel, which they were going to refuel from. And as he came in to land, he saw this rubber bag going past, and he wanted to get round to it, so he put on just that too much. I was lucky, I went to the end. I was the only one. There was the second Canberra was coming up behind me. He'd had trouble, and I refueled, but the little problem that we had a burst fuel pipe there, which covered the aircraft in fuel. But I didn't know it had happened because it was all happening behind me, and I was sitting out in the front there and saying to the chiefy, "Can I start up?" And he said, "No, no, no." So I waited, and he still looked very doubtful about starting, but what I didn't know is I had chaps on the wing still, wiping it down. But in the end I got bored and I started, and they all jumped off like rats leaving a sinking ship. It didn't catch fire at all. So we got away there, and we went on and had our second bout of night. In other words, in the 23 hours I flew, we had about 6 hours daylight and the rest was night, darkness. So we ran into darkness going into Perth and landed there about midnight. Are you happy with how it's going? Because
I'm quite happy actually. Carry on, you're doing well. I haven't had to prompt you at all because you're relaying it quite well. It's fine.
Well, it's a long time ago, and one forgets these things. I did forget to mention that our problem with the hydraulics would have been put me out of the race if we'd have had to take a hydraulic pump off at Scheibe. But there was a little sergeant there And I said, well, what are you going to do, Sergeant? He said, look, he said, I reckon it's the recuperator, a stuck recuperator. He said, I'm going to shut the door and lock you in. I've got a panel off. It was all pitch black. They hadn't got any lights at all because they didn't want to destroy our night vision, which I think was one of those crazy things. But anyway, he said, you start up and I'll be on the wing and I'll tap it with a hammer. He had a damn great hammer in his hand. And he said, if the hydraulics come on, you flash a torch. And he said, I'll put the panel back on and you can go. And that's just what happened. So we lost almost no time at all. And we got on our way. And it never gave any more trouble, that particular bit of equipment. Anyway, I've got you as far as Perth. And at Perth, when the door was opened, I decided I hadn't had a pee from the time I'd left London, and I thought the time had come. So I got out of the airplane, and Wing Commander Hodges, the captain of the flight, was there, and he said, he told me his trouble. He'd got one generator had failed completely, and he wasn't, it was an electric airplane, and he wasn't too happy about taking off in Australia to fly a night leg all the way, arriving in New Zealand and dawn on one generator. So he asked me my opinion, and I wasn't, I mean, I knew precisely what I would do, but I didn't like to influence him one way or the other, but I said, well, it is a bit dicey going off on one, so I'll leave it, you know, you'll have to make up your own mind, which he did. And I stood by the wingtip of the airplane and had a most horrific relief. And standing beside me in a large picture hat and a notebook while I had my pee was an Australian reporter, and she was most interested to hear you know, how it had gone so far and what our reactions were, and I didn't say very much because it seemed inappropriate at that time, and got back in and we went off. Now, there were one or two little points which I remember now after all this time. It was the first time I'd got out of the airplane, and as I said earlier, that we set the aircraft all up for takeoff after landing when we were taxiing in. And so I got back in the airplane, strapped myself in and tied all the things together as one had to, and started up and taxied out. Now, when they put the oxygen in, the corporal armourer, in his usual way, had reached into the cockpit and turned my oxygen off. And as I say, at that time, we were not turning anything off. We were leaving it all ready. So that was a slight mistake. And the next thing was that as we were on the end of the runway and ready for takeoff, Constellation of ANZET, Australian Airways, was coming in on the other end to land towards us. And I told the tower I was holding. They said, no, no, don't hold. He's going to go round again. So I said, are you certain? And the captain of the, he was on the same frequency, called up and said, yes, okay, mate, you take off. So I said, thanks very much, and I took off, you see. And he was going over at about 500 feet, and I went underneath him and climbed away on course. And about 5 minutes later, the navigator said, Monty, put your mute switch off and listen to the radio. So I listened to the radio, and he'd tuned into Perth, local radio station, and I heard the commentator who said he was at the Air Race terminal, and he'd just seen the most disgraceful piece of airmanship where 120 innocent Australian souls are very nearly consigned by a maniac in a Canberra who took off straight at them and so on. So Tom said, that doesn't sound so good, does it? They're going to eliminate us. I said, well, we can't do anything about it now. And then about 5 minutes later he said, hey, listen to this. So I heard a chap called MacDonald, who said he was the controller, the chief controller at Perth International Airport, and he said that the incident that has just been commented on had been arranged for 6 months previously. So obviously they were fairly happy about that. But then the other little thing was that we were climbing away with gay abandon, and I wasn't getting any oxygen. And I started feeling a bit queer at about 30,000 feet. We pressurized, you see, so 24. And I realized, because one does, if you've done a lot of high altitude flying in Canberras and also in Mosquitoes, you get very conscious of oxygen. And so I got my wandering lead and looked round the cockpit, looked at my oxygen, and the little balls weren't floating, so I turned it on, and I'd asked Don, I said, "How do you feel, Don?" He said, "None the better for you asking me. These bloody navigators," they had navigators at the points to set up the, can't add up. He said, "I've got to sort this flight plan all out again." So I wasn't getting any help from him, and I found what was wrong with me anyway. His was probably still on, so he was all right. Incredible relief, you know. I felt very near to tears with big sobs welling in my chest. Oxygen just wiped it away. Enthusiasm, and we were back in business. And eventually we flew over Melbourne, on track more or less for Christchurch. And there, of course, all hell was let loose. They wanted to know where we were. We were being called up by Australian hams all over the place, and they said, where were we? And we kept mum and went over. I did call up in the end when we were overhead Melbourne and said we'd left Melbourne and we were on our way to Christchurch, and they called me up and said, "We're sorry to say that our number 2 airplane has had a nose wheel stick up at Woomera." They'd gone into Woomera. So I commiserated with them, because I think he was ahead of me at that time. And we carried on. And fortunately, the Australians had put GCA in at Christchurch, because they had no landing aids at all. They just, for their own purposes, they used to come in on QDHs, which is a voice-controlled approach. And when we got within striking distance of Christchurch, and we actually heard Christchurch themselves, they told us that the weather was down to about 300 feet at the time we first spoke to them, in a continuous rain. And they said, what were we going to do? And I said, well, what can we do? And they said, well, we've got GCA. I said, well, let's get that going. Ground controlled approach. And shortly afterwards, after the controller, they all sounded a little bit better for alcohol, and I think they probably were. It was very cold and they'd been waiting a long time. They said, how would you like to finish the race? Will you come overhead at 1,000 feet, or will you finish it when you cross the finishing line? So I said, what did you say the cloud base was? He said, well, it's gone up to 400 feet. So I said, well, if we fly over at 1,000 feet, they won't see much, will they? So he said, there you have a point. So we didn't bother. We did a GCA, and we were very pleased to see the runway at about 400 feet and land. And we couldn't say we'd won at that time, but when the elapsed time between us and Pete Raw, the second Canberra, Australian Canberra, had elapsed, which was 10 minutes, we knew we'd won the race. That was great fun. And then, of course, Pete Raw came in. He had had the nose wheel collapse, and it had wiped off his pitot head. They put a pitot head on, they joined it up with paper clips and screwed it in with wood screws at the bottom. And he'd buckled his the nose, well, they took off the nose wheel doors, and he'd got a split in the pressure cabin, so he wasn't getting pressurization, but he took off. It wasn't a long leg he had to do. And when he came in overhead, they couldn't really hear him very well, because he'd damaged his VHF aerial in some way. So he wasn't able to use the GCA, But by this time the cloud base had gone up a bit, and he went out to sea and let down and came in and landed. And the first word the great Australian public heard him say was shit, because they had all the intercom relayed to the great public. So yeah, that was it. We'd arrived, and we were met by the Prime Minister and Air Marshal Sir R.L.E Chapman and a load of other people. I don't remember them all now. And it was a great event as far as they were concerned. And as I said, they're so very patriotic and British that the fact that they had been made 23 hours, 51 minutes away from England was a great boost to their morale, and generally it was a great thing. They felt it very strongly. It wasn't thought about in England because the great British public is not in the same position.
That's fine, that's excellent.